But what happened in Europe is that you are short energy in the most literal sense. In the most physical sense, you are short energy. And it's my read at this point that governments and companies see something that they can't even get their heads around, and they can't engage in the market at this price. They don't know what to do. They don't understand what they're seeing. It breaks every possible norm that any economist or market regulator or politician is ever used to seeing. And they're just paralyzed. And the public has no idea. They think that this is sort of like that inflation that's sort of been happening, or things are going to get a little more expensive. They don't know what's coming.
It is my pleasure to be joined by Mark Nilsson, the managing director of the Radiant Energy Group. Welcome, Mark, to the Real Vision platform.
Good to be here, Andreas.
I guess let's start with the sort of most present issues in Germany. You just told me that you got off the plane flying to Europe just recently, and you went out the plane watching the electricity price going bananas in Europe. What's your take on the current issues in Europe, first of all?
Energy costs more than Europeans are currently worth to themselves. That's a very dangerous thing to say. I don't say that thinking, haha, you silly people messed up your energy policy. If anything, we just got lucky in America having so much fossil fuels to get us out of our own particular bind. But what happened in Europe is that you are short energy in the most literal sense. In the most physical sense, you are short energy. And it's my read at this point that governments and companies see something that they can't even get their heads around, and they can't engage in the market at this price. They don't know what to do. They don't understand what they're seeing. It breaks every possible norm that any economist or market regulator or politician is ever used to seeing. And they're just paralyzed. And the public has no idea. They think that this is sort of like that inflation that's sort of been happening, or things are going to get a little more expensive. They don't know what's coming. And it just was reemphasized when I get off the plane, and lots of people are talking about different things. They're glad to be home. I was in the line with the Americans and British people are all in the same line. And just, I was looking around, looking at the price on my phone of electricity contracts going up, 700 euros a megawatt hour for baseload 2023 in France. Or in Germany, 800 euros for the same thing in France. And I'm just looking at these, and life shuts down at that cost. You just can't run an economy at that cost. Now, of course, that's just the sharp edge. That's the next marginal unit being bought or sold in this crazy market. That's not the whole volume, but it's absolutely clear that the politicians are paralyzed and the public has no idea what's coming.
Yeah, I perfectly agree with that assessment. By the way, I had an opinion letter in a Danish newspaper this weekend saying the exact same thing, that no one's talking about how grave this situation is. But if we look at the forward pricing of electricity and natural gas into the winter in Europe, it is even priced to increase compared to current spot levels when we look at the contracts in December 2022 and January next year. Is it your assessment that the scarcity of energy is worsening by the minute right now?
At this point, what does scarcity mean? What would it mean to run out compared to not running out at the current prices? Just to give a weird little example for electricity in the United States. So my family's from Oklahoma. Oklahoma's just north of Texas. They don't connect very much in electricity, and they have different electricity markets. In the famous February 2021 blackouts in Texas, there was just massive failure to deliver energy. There's something like a quarter below expected demand in the ability to deliver power, with millions of people out of power. In Oklahoma, there was some power outages in a number of places, but they kept enough electricity on, traded at near the market cap, that they are going to be paying off billions for like 2 decades. So is that better or worse? At what point do you just have to not have energy because there's a financial collapse at paying for it at the price that is being offered on the shredded remains of the market? Sorry, that wasn't a complete answer to your question, but it's just, at this point, scarcity, running out, these words stop being meaningful in terms that we've seen before. Perhaps this is why we're not hearing people talk about it. To even talk about it is to sound like a uh, blathering Chicken Little. Oh, we're all going to die. It's so high, it breaks every possible norm that to even bring it up is to show you almost certainly don't have any way to make it better, or maybe almost no way to make it better. We'll get to that. And what are you going to offer people? Better to just ride through, straight through. And if it doesn't turn out to be a crisis somehow, at this point, it's hard to see it not being a really mortal crisis, then you don't look dumb having brought it up and sounded like a Chicken Little. And if you can't do anything about it, that sounds even more weak and powerless. So maybe that explains the lack of discussion, the paralysis that we're seeing.
Do you think we should expect blackouts in Europe this winter?
It's really difficult. So first of all, blackout is a word that can cover a number of different things. I was recently on the BBC to talk a little bit about something that's a form of blackout, you can say. Feels like a blackout for those it happens to, and that's load shedding. That's when the grid operator knows that they won't be able to meet demand. They expect not to be able to do it, and they have a tiered system for who gets cut off of power at what time based on the expected deficiency, and then any surprises that come up, positive or negative, they'll adjust from there. So load shedding is when you might think of it as when you've planned badly over a long period of time and you know it going into a tough night, a tough day, a tough week. And blackouts, we typically use that in public discourse to mean a sudden accidental loss of power from some extreme event, maybe, or maybe damage to aspects of the grid that deliver power, or damage to specific power plants, maybe. Where load shedding is just a general lack of enough energy that then has to be assigned to different parties at different times. And so to answer your question, I expect that we will have some load shedding. And here's another thing though. I expect that a great deal of future damage is going to be done to minimize the load shedding and especially minimize the blackouts. That is, we're going to eat the seed corn. We are going to eat the stalk of seed that was supposed to grow next year's harvest and the year after that. And that will help get us through this winter better than we deserve based on how much energy we found for the continent.
Makes a whole lot of sense, that point. If we look at the underlying reasons why Europe has ended up in this situation, what's your assessment of the sort of political backdrop leading to this crisis in Europe?
At this point, the whiplash narrative from COVID disruption is pretty well known. And I assume that you've probably talked about it, and it's covered in a lot of different forums where you had a drop in demand compared to expected. That led to low prices from oversupply, and then an increase in demand suddenly that could not be accommodated by either, you might say, the long-term secular trend of lower investment in fuel-based energies, shall we say, fuel-based. We can expand that later, but in just trying to explain how I see this crisis, it's that there's clearly only room for a certain difference between supply and demand. In electricity, very tiny. You physically, moment to moment, there's no difference. You have to exactly match. Doing that over a longer period of time is a slightly different thing, but is connected to the same problem. In gas, clearly there's a little bit more room to have difference in supply and demand over a day, week, month. By the time you get difference in supply and demand over a season, that's more than the seasonal rhythms of the gas storage and withdrawal and burning seasons that are already there. When you get a little bit more burn or a little bit of a deficit in how much you're supposed to fill, you start seeing these pretty wild price swings. Coal is a little bit more stable, it seems. And the reason I feel that makes sense is because it's chunky, it's easy you can store it in a big pile. So its physical attributes make it a little bit easier to handle. Why did I mention all those different fuels? Because in the end, the ability to cope with demand changes, moment to moment, day to day, week to week, season to season, year to year, comes from having the option to turn up the burners, to turn up the plants, to turn up the gas pipelines, to turn up the nuclear reactors if you plan far enough ahead. But we'll get to that one. And I just don't think that planning occurred. And I think that there was this thing where long tail events in, say, energy models for whole nations were covered by, I'm sure we'll be able to get exports from somebody, or we'll just pay a little more at the edge of our model. But when everybody's model links up together like some, like the devil's jigsaw puzzle, and everyone expects to be the one whose long tail event is covered by leaning a little bit more on others, doesn't add up. And it didn't add up together as a whole continent. There are other little weird things in that story that we could focus on. I don't know if the detail is worth it here, but during a fairly critical period last year, not only what did it turn out that Russia was not sending gas supplies that normally they would have and normally would have been expected, but there was an unusually high price starting to gather because there was just a huge wind drought. Now, over the course of the year, the wind recovered a bit towards the winter, and the winter was a little bit more mild, but during a fairly key period of last year, there was just really still winds across all of Europe pretty much at the same time. Those little things are going to start mattering more and more as Europe I don't know if they're going to continue, we'll see. But if Europe continues to base its energy supply in bulk on weather patterns, well, I don't know if you've heard about this climate change people are talking about, but you can't really base your energy supply, which is there partly to respond and to smooth out the harshness of nature, to smooth out the weather, right? Both the weather as it affects farming and harvesting, or the weather as it affects transportation or demand, that's tricky enough. When you're making the weather have to fuel you at the base level, boy, I just don't think even if we can handle it maybe in some places, or eventually we might be able to, people, societies, leaders, we're not ready for having both supply and demand be strongly affected by the weather. That's the way I read the current crisis.
Hi, I'm Raoul Pal, the CEO and co-founder of Real Vision. The financial world is a complicated world right now. It's a really complicated macro picture, and there's a lot of risks. Real Vision and our YouTube channel help you navigate those risks. So subscribe now to the channel and never miss an update. There is simply too much going on. So subscribe now. Thank you.
We'll get back to the discussion on whether it will be possible to sort of store the energy from renewables over time, but it's certainly not a question for the short term, at least. If we look at the political discussion in Germany and other core countries in Europe, I'd like to take the discussion all the way back to 2011 and the crisis at the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan, because it sort of fueled the debate in Europe towards ending the dependency on nuclear plants to a certain extent. And basically post that crisis in Japan, Germany took a very clear step towards removing nuclear from the electrical grid. What's your sort of assessment of the travel of journey here in Europe and the spillovers to the current crisis?
Right before I answer that, I want to point out a very interesting phrase you used, a very valuable phrase, I think. You pointed out that Fukushima Daiichi scared Europe about its reliance on nuclear, right? That's because you can rely on nuclear. So they had. More in some places, less in some places, though, as we're seeing, Andreas, as we just discussed at some length, there's no such thing as only Denmark having enough energy or only Germany having enough energy and others not, and it being okay. No, kind of when a country the size of France that relies on nuclear as much as France does has problems, everybody's going to start having problems, because it turns out that everyone's model pretty much assumed that the amount that France has lost in its nuclear production this year, that was just a little bit too extreme for models to predict, right? So there is a dependency on nuclear in Europe. That's because you can. And that's not true for all energy sources. So let's hold that thought. And let's move to the accident itself and the aftermath. So in Japan, a country where, as of this week, 60% of the public wants nuclear to come on to address the energy crisis, they had a bit of a cultural issue with the management of nuclear plants. They had a safety issue before Fukushima Daiichi. They had pretty lethal accidents going on in their nuclear plants, like steam accidents that killed a bunch of people, right? So that was not great. That would have been a bit of a smoking gun. Their plants were not available all that often. They were not very good in terms of uptime, which is a sort of warning signal. It doesn't mean that plants that are up all the time are guaranteed to be flawless. It just is an indicator of things working really well with the work culture at the nuclear plant. Sort of like the German nuclear plants have just outstanding power availability, just brilliant, right? It says something about the quality of work, the quality of design and construction at the German nuclear plants. Well, Japanese nuclear plants were struggling a little bit even before the accident, Fukushima Daiichi. What happened was an earthquake and tsunami. It was very large and very damaging, and it crippled the plant and its backup safety systems. And then there were 3 meltdowns in boiling water reactor units, and then hydrogen from breaking apart water under high temperature. The water came into contact with metal that helped it split apart and make hydrogen. Well, that hydrogen accumulated and blew up, made some very dramatic imagery, and spread radiation around Japan and around the ocean. So nobody actually got a radiation burn. And as far as we can tell scientifically, we're not going to be able to observe in the data, no matter how much we survey, more cancer deaths. So the amount of radiation was just too small in exposure. It's just not acceptable for us as an industry, for us in nuclear, that came as a result of, say, evacuations or the destruction of habitable areas, or even extremely expensive cleanup operations that led to people being able to move back in. That should never have to happen, and that's our failure, and we have to own it. Sure enough, after that occurred, the nuclear plants that Europe does rely on had safety upgrades and more training and increasingly sophisticated stress tests that check to see whether you could survive, a tsunami on the Rhine, for example. Could your plant handle that? Could your plant handle an extreme event that knocked out this and knocked out that and knocked out those and knocked out those people and that command center? And these nuclear plants across Europe had to respond to these training exercises and to give a satisfactory response. I would argue that some of the excellence we're seeing at Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant of keeping a 6-unit plant partially on and not having an accident while being shelled and occupied by a foreign power, that's part of the extraordinary gift we got from the disaster that was Fukushima Daiichi. But what happened at the policy level in Europe is that for countries that were wobbling on the edge of how soon to get rid of their nuclear plants, it gave a big kick off the cliff. So countries like Belgium that had been, trying to get rid of nuclear, but not quite getting it done and not quite getting the replacement done, and had been kind of wishy-washy, they really decided to stick to it this time and get rid of the 50% of their electricity that comes from nuclear instead of natural gas, right? So perfect timing for them. And Germany, I think, is one of the key countries you're looking at, but I think France will come to afterwards, and they're more important because they're more reliant on nuclear, and their response is much less known. What they did to respond to Fukushima Daiichi and just a general cultural turnaround on nuclear, we'll get to. But in Germany, the most famous example, the Conservative Party that had been the bulwark for nuclear, that had pushed back against nuclear phase out, flipped and said, nope, we never want to face this while we're in power. We're gonna work to get rid of these nuclear plants by 2022. So that was Merkel's big turnaround, having been scared, horrified even by the events in Japan. I don't think it was just about defending her electoral position, though, if you want to be cynical, you can read it that way. It just became impossible for her to see how she would lead Germany through a nuclear plant accident when she was the one who was helping push back on the closures. So Germany scheduled closure by 2022. And here's a really critical thing. If Russia were trying to just set this whole thing up and just cause this disaster in Europe, they played this one beautifully. They had a schedule. I mean, it was easy, but they still played it beautifully. They had a schedule of the nuclear shutdowns in Germany. They started with the weakest plants, the weakest, smallest plants straight away. The worst operating ones, which in Germany is still pretty good. Then they went for the slightly bigger, slightly newer plants. Finally, they came to a point where they were only closing maybe one reactor every few years. Until finally at the end, in 2 years only, 12 months and 1 day period from December 31st, 2021 to December 31st, 2022. They had to close 6 reactors, the largest and most productive reactors in the world, or nearly so, before the newest EPRs came on. And they had to shut those down, the best performing units on the planet. They had to shut those down in a tiny period of time, a sharp shock, when they'd already shown as a continent that the continent was not capable of replacing that quantity of fueled energy in an environment of concern about carbon and an environment of anti-nuclear attitudes. So Germany just put itself straight into a classic energy crisis that may have occurred even if the rest of Europe wasn't suffering. Germany may have been an outlier here. They certainly would have had a big jump in electricity costs.
If we look at the details, so the numbers on a country by country level, how important is nuclear for the electrical grid across Europe?
Well, as for Europe as a whole, I believe nuclear is still something like, what is it, 35-40%. It's pretty high volume there. That's fallen in recent years because of Germany getting out, and a few other countries like Sweden. Sweden has taxed several of its nuclear units into oblivion without being able to replace the southern power. I mean, there's a north and south power imbalance issue, and they had some of the cheapest operating plants in the world, Andreas. So they decided to see if they could fatally milk it, and they did. They achieved it. They got some shutdown of some units. It's just so casual from the perspective of 2022. Looking at these energy charts go up, it looks like the people of Europe were defrauded. But I myself know how hard it was to get people's attention on these issues. I've been campaigning and trying to speak to this both in public and in private in Europe since 2017. And it just was barely interesting before it was a crisis. I think that brings us to France. I think we should go to France.
Let's do that.
Great. So everyone's heard that the French nuclear plants are doing poorly. This is a huge story because they're not supposed to do poorly. Doing poorly is for other energy sources. Nuclear, you're supposed to be able to rely on. See, we're grading on a curve. We treat these power sources differently. Nuclear is expected to be an absolute bedrock that just always delivers. And so you can tax it and squeeze it and crush it and bleed it, and it's just there. That's what the French discovered. You could take its revenue, and you could take its prestige, and you could defund it, and you could put in laws requiring not a closure per chance, maybe not really a closure in the law, but you could require there to be way less energy produced. But how do you do that except by how do you produce a giant fraction less energy from the nuclear fleet without closing it? Eventually you just have to, I don't know, defund repairs, de-emphasize returns to operation, lower your staffing requirements. I mean, there's still a law passed in 2015 on the books in France requiring exactly the sort of decline that we're seeing right now. It's on the books, Andreas. France would be breaking its law if it were just headed straight up and doing well and responding and providing for Europe. It would be against the law that set out that by 2025, nuclear had to fall to 50% of French production. Now, the fleet, in absolute disarray, is looking to provide 59, 60, 61, 62, 65%, depending on how things shake out this winter. And it's supposed to be at 50% by 2025 under law that's on the books in France. I'd say EDF is meeting their goals. The goal was just murderous, you see?
So if you look at the current debate ongoing in France, it seems as if the current heat wave and the high temperatures in rivers in France has taken at least part of the blame for nuclear capacity not being as high as usual. Would you concur with that assessment, or is it a part of a bigger story?
River conditions are definitely playing a factor in lower French nuclear production. Now, it's kind of two different things. One, laws for the protection of the environment local to the nuclear plant, just downstream of the discharge of the nuclear plant, I think they're important. I think it's important for nuclear plants to be able to exist on a river, especially multiple plants on these long rivers of France, without degrading the habitat for wildlife, for organisms, for plants, aquatic plants. we're definitely in a point where there is going to be a trade-off between people and these plants and animals. The regulations for the how hot water can be coming out of a nuclear plant. This isn't water that's like radioactive or anything like that. It's just hotter because it takes away waste heat needed to make nuclear plants or any thermal power plant work. Well, these laws and regulations are, I think, pretty strict in order to fully protect the rivers. And I think they could be strict in the past, especially because you just had so many nuclear plants and such low demand in the summer months. Now, I think you have to take a look and say, what is the what are the fish worth in terms of human life years? If we see we're creeping up on energy poverty, if we see there's a trade-off between gas burn now and gas burn in the winter, and if a major constriction is the water temperature controls at the French riverine plants, not the coastal ones, then I think that might deserve a look and maybe some adjustment. And sure enough, there have been some temporary adjustments and removals of some of those limits at some of these river-based plants. But the bigger problem is what's coming, which is, I would say that's less than half of the issue at the moment in the French nuclear fleet. And it's one that is by definition seasonal and will be solved just by turning of summer months towards winter. What's much more worrying to me than the river conditions, and note that the river conditions have not been a limitation in Germany. They haven't been a limitation in Spain. So there are many countries that are handling this without the problems that the French are. So the bigger problem in France is, compared to the river conditions, which are temporary, can be adjusted, and aren't going to be an issue in the winter, is that a bunch of the French plants have been found to have a pipe that's part of one of the emergency safety cooling systems. Some of those pipes have little cracks around them. Now, we've seen results from cutting these pipes out, looking at them, examining them. They're not deep enough. I was quite worried about these at first. They're not deep enough that there would have been a failure of the system if it had been called upon. So that was a really important thing we had to see. There were a bunch of people who said, oh, French regulators just being too strict. Well, hold up. This is a part that really needs to work, and you need to know it works. Now that we see that at least in the first couple of units that have been examined, the cracks are not too deep, they should all be repaired. This shouldn't be repeated. It should be an important learning moment, but it's clear that the safety systems would work as designed. Now, I have not been there to inspect the pipes myself. I've not gone there and touched them and seen them, and I rely on the opinion of people with much more expertise in metallurgy and the specific systems and the conditions under which they'd be called to operate. I am relying on what I've heard from them, but I trust them.
So let's address quite a few of the questions that we've received in relation to this debate on nuclear, since we now have an expert on board. And the first question I would like to ask you in relation to some of the caveats, potentially, of the nuclear technology is the one on the reliance on foreign powers. If we look at the nuclear technology, you obviously need natural resources in that technology as well as you do with other technologies. But would nuclear allow Europe to be more self-sufficient compared to burning gas, for example?
Absolutely, without any doubt. And it's just about the volumes and the stability of that fuel. So here's what I mean. You need a colossal volume of gas flowing into Europe or being shipped into Europe in liquid form, an immense amount all the time. If that gets cut off, things get really ugly very fast, no matter how much you've got in storage. It gets like the storage is something like, 10% of the total volume burned in a year. It's just not, that's good. That's amazing. That's the biggest, best energy storage in the world, carbon emissions notwithstanding, methane leakage notwithstanding. In terms of staying alive, that's extraordinary, and we have no match for it yet. Even my beloved French nuclear fleet that's so down on its luck, in the winter time, it did provide a peaking sort of like 45 terawatt hours of uranium electricity that was, because they had really high uptime in the winter. I mean, US plants are high uptime all the time, but if you can't have that in France, you have really high uptime in the winter. And they had sort of a 10% of their total yearly power was that extra amount produced in the winter compared to the slow summer months. So they sort of do that on like a 1/10 scale, energy scale for the French nuclear fleet, but there's just no answer for what we get from this underground storage. But you still run out very fast if the flows aren't coming in, if the ships aren't docking. And those ships are docking because we're outbidding the developing world. We're outbidding people for their lives, because it wasn't Europe that was hugely investing in expanding fossil fuels that are now being redirected to keep Europe alive, because the fossil fuels that it did invest in, like the pipelines from Russia, are being cut off. So I don't think you can compare this really gassy, spacey little molecules that bounce around and take a huge amount of room, like the little prima donnas they are. You can't compare that to nuclear fuel. If a European country wanted to, they could go out there on the market and just start stockpiling. In a year, they could stockpile a decade of fuel. Like, you can't do that with any other source. You can't do that with coal. Even coal is much better, and coal is approximately 1,000,000 times less energy dense than the nuclear fuel. That means you can get your nuclear fuel from a number of different countries if that's what you need it. The various services are all kind of fungible. True, we'd need to build up some of those services that used to come from Russia. That is, say, enrichment, where you increase the proportion of one type of uranium isotope, one flavor of uranium atom compared to the other type. You want to increase that to work better in our reactors. You're going to need facilities that spin it really fast. That's the centrifuges that we hear about with Iran. Well, you're going to need more centrifuges if you're not getting it from Russia, but you can stockpile the material. You can stockpile the services, and you can do it because uranium is 1,000,000 times more energy dense than coal. And if we're talking about just room temperature and pressure, it's approximately 1,000,000,000 times more energy dense than natural gas. That's stunning. That's why you can just stockpile it. So I've heard a lot people saying, oh, Germany used to get some stuff. The story always changes. Like, Germany was getting uranium from Russia. Well, not really. Uranium, that's just not what Russia does. They're barely a net producer of uranium, right? So already, it's not that there wasn't some not dependency. There wasn't some usage of Russian services in Germany. It's that it was not a dependency. And it wasn't the uranium itself, which seems to trigger a stronger emotional response, though all parts of the uranium fuel cycle are important to getting the finished fuel in the reactor. And also, Andreas, it's an especially stupid and dishonest reason not to continue operation when you could just select suppliers that aren't Russia. They're available, they're waiting, they just need a call.
If we look for a solution short term, I think a lot of the questions that we've received surrounding critical points for nuclear is that building a new nuclear power plant will take 5-7 years on average. Correct me if I'm wrong. So when we need a solution now, why nuclear?
So it's right. If we were good at building nuclear plants, really good, Andreas, then the time between when we declare here's going to be a nuclear plant, let's start digging today, to when we get first nuclear concrete is sort of the starting gun used by IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to say start of construction. I've had some very well-taken criticism from people saying, oh, you get 2 years to build before you even start construction. That doesn't sound very honest. Okay, fair. So you need this pre-build-up time. Your first nuclear construction, the concrete that goes right under the future reactor, and then you need to finish it, and then you need to commission it. The best in the world right now is China, where at already existing nuclear plants where they're just adding units, they're able to add units in about 4.5-5 years. Some of the craziest times we've seen in recent decades has been in Japan at existing plants, where at one point they added a reactor in 48 months from first concrete to full commercial operation. It was only 36 months to turning on the core and first criticality. That's wild. Can we get back there? I don't know, but it takes a long time. And if you aren't good at it, it's going to take even longer. 8, 9, 10 years, painful years, right? So if I were coming on here to say investors invest, well, we need a program. What's a program? So the UAE was at, here's something else more generally. Every single year you think, well, this is the year that's really important. Anything that takes time, we better not start it this year because we'll need it now and the future's different. No, actually, every single year is the best year to start building the things that make you survive well long term. If you haven't already done it, you should start it. Now, we can argue that our abilities as a society have fallen so low that we are literally only in like rabid starving rats mode, scurrying around a dumpster looking for the last bit of rotten, stew bone to gnaw on before death. Is that where we are? Or are we a little better and maybe we can do 2 different projects at one time? We can do the temporary energy or the energy no one expects to rely on, the other energies, because we expect to rely on nuclear, as you pointed out yourself. And then we can build the energy that we expect to rely on and that does not make us dependent on foreign powers, as I described, for the long-term future so that we don't have this crisis forever, or maybe more optimistically, so we don't have this crisis once per decade. Whenever Russia decides to turn off the gas and remind Germany who's boss.
So now that we're at it, let's address a couple of caveats further here. The one that I get the most questions on is what to do with the nuclear waste. It's been an ongoing debate for decades. Do you have new information for the audience on how to deal with waste?
I do indeed. The first comment I'm going to make is, how there was almost no fuel? You can just stockpile an immense amount for tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people in tiny little sheds on pretty quick notice. And you just keep it there and it just does fine sitting there and you can just put it in your reactor. Right. Well, that means that there's almost no waste. If there's almost no fuel and no chemical reactions happen, you're not burning it or making combustion products or anything like that, then the waste that comes out, the high level waste, the really spicy stuff that people are really talking about and say they're afraid of, that's the spent nuclear fuel. There's almost none of it, Andreas. It means that a country the size of most European countries, like a Switzerland or a Belgium or a Netherlands, they can put it all under one roof pretty easily. Or they can put it out the way America does, out on a concrete pad next to the nuclear plant. And if they need a little bit more space, they add like a few basketball courts worth. It's just not, even in a very packed Europe, that's not any issue. Each person's personal lifetime energy waste from a nuclear plant operating the way ours do is going to be like that much. Spacing it out a little, it's about that much. Giving it some shielding, that much. That's not much, considering just what people order off of Amazon in terms of volume. To get all the energy you need for your life that way, that's not much waste. So now that we've cleared up that there's almost none of it, now let's say, are we protected from it now? What's the situation now? Are people stumbling off of a shift, just dazzled and bleeding from their time spent guarding nuclear waste? No, they're not. There's, if anything, some of these nuclear waste buildings that I've been in are lower radiation than outside the building because their walls are thick, so it blocks the cosmic radiation. So it's not like there's an ongoing problem. This is sort of a fear of future problems. Like, what if we can't read anymore? Or all our cities have been burned and now we're stumbling around looking like so many of these rats after stew bones. What if we find some big, thick steel and concrete canisters and we're like, the best use of our final calories of fuel in our bodies is to try to dig through this 3 feet, this meter thick of just like things trying to block us. No, it's not going to happen. People going for nuclear waste know what they're going for. And they don't go for it because you can get whatever you need to do radiation and fueling from not nuclear waste. It's just not a great source. So it means that your options for dealing with it are more about public communications, public access. They're more about vibes than the engineering, because the engineering is trivial. Just make it thick and watch it. That's all. You make it thick, the canister, the shielding, the hole in the ground, just make it thick and let it sit. That's all. So my favorite is what the Dutch do. The Dutch have a facility that's super bright orange and has a big E equals MC squared painted on it because, it's a reference to the conversion of matter straight to energy. And that's what nuclear is doing. It's pretty cool. And you can visit it, and there's a museum where you can see old radioactive consumer products before they were banned. And then you can see things like a glow-in-the-dark picture of Marie Curie made by an artist, a well-meaning artist, and it got confiscated because it was a little too radioactive. So they took it to the museum and said, you can always come visit your artwork here. And then there's a cloud chamber showing, especially when kids visit, showing that this cloud chamber just reveals that we are in a radioactive universe, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I just stood there in trance I used up a bunch of the time we were supposed to use actually touring the nuclear waste. I just stood there taking phone videos and just staring at that cloud chamber in a dark room where you see these astral lines, just, these particles, the beta, the gamma, the alpha radiation just popping and making these little bubbles that then fade away into the darkness. That was incredible. And that's the radiation. And then the guy who built the facility and directs it for the Dutch public, he just explains that's that type of radiation. We block it this way. That's that type of radiation. It just goes through space until it finds something, and just we can block it with this amount of material. And you can demonstrate with pieces of paper you block this radiation, which with thicker things you block this radiation. And then you go see that they've done it. You go see the facilities where they have this radioactive waste, and they show that you can walk around it because they built the thick structures you need to block the waste. And they commission beautiful artworks to interpret what does 1,000 years mean? What does 10,000 years mean? So they had artists come and depict what that meant. What does that stewardship of this material mean? And then you finish the tour and you have a little dose badge, and they're like, you didn't get any. All right. See you next time. And they have a cafe. I didn't get to go to the cafe, so I have unfinished business there. That is how you handle the nuclear waste. And now the Dutch are fine, and they're going to get a new nuclear program if they can get started on it. That's how to handle it, Andreas. Sorry if that was longer than you might have wanted, but...
It was a lovely answer. But last thing I wanted to address is the not in my backyard issue surrounding nuclear. If I gave you the opportunity to just place nuclear plants around the European map, where would you place them?
Oh, that's effortless. Where they already are. Why? Because people love a nuclear plant. Feelings towards wind and solar plants typically, not saying there aren't some exceptions, but feelings towards wind and solar plants by locals is anywhere from absolute loathing, deranging hate that makes you go crazy, in the case of some wind farms, all the way to, whatever, it's part of the landscape. For nuclear plants, it's not really so neutral. It's more like, this is our life. This was my grandfather worked at this nuclear plant. My father worked at this nuclear plant. Now I worked at this nuclear plant. I've heard that, by the way. In the southwest England, I've heard somebody describe their relationship with a nuclear plant that way. 3 generations working at the same facility. And because nuclear plants fill up the local coffers and provide a huge amount of ultra-stable employment, if you don't, turn the plants off with policy, then they end up making rich communities that live and eat and play and just everything that you would expect from a beautiful, meaningful life in the side of the plant, in the plant itself, if they're employed directly. And that's kind of special. So I would say give the people what they want, increase the reactors at the plants. What you often find is that the people much further from the plant or with extremely specific interest in the plant, like very certain types of property values, because in general, nuclear plant will make all the villages a little bit more expensive. Yeah, that's the pattern we typically see. But if you have new people, or if you have people making a specific play for tourism or whatever, then there can be conflicts. We're seeing some of that with another of the plants proposed in England, on the other side, southeast England. So the NIMBY problem in nuclear is not quite what you think. It's more like people from far away who want to troll. So an example that I've heard from colleagues in Poland is that a big bus filled with geriatric Germans came across the border and came and protested at the site that the Polish government chose for a nuclear plant, which is partly based on the people around that site wanting it. there, right? That's not in my backyard, is it? Right? That's far away. That's whole buses traveling for hours to go interfere in other people's energy decisions. And I think maybe what's happening is that if you feel that nuclear is the worst thing in the world, the most dangerous thing in the world, that any accident of any level at any nuclear plant in the world is all of us dying together in a big cancerous fire, then your whole planet is your backyard. You don't even mind the actual coal plant literally in your backyard if there's a nuclear plant anywhere to go stop. That's what I think I see in people when I'm trying to be empathetic and understand why they would attack nuclear so far away. It's because they feel that a planet with any nuclear plants anywhere is always going to be a harm versus having any other type of energy. It's just we're finally getting to a time, Andreas, where nuclear is becoming suddenly much more popular in Europe because there isn't other energy. There isn't actually an option. And that probably brings us to the most interesting part of our discussion, the one that got us tangled up on Twitter and in each other's faces.
Yeah, I mean, spot on, Mark, because Real Vision is obviously a community of investors and free thinkers. So we ultimately want to know the answer to the question whether nuclear will get back into the limelight, both in the US, but also in Europe. If we look at the average fleet age in Europe or in the US, it's probably around 25 to 30 years right now. So will we ever get back a revival of the nuclear trends that we saw in the 70s and the 80s?
Eventually we will. Everywhere we will. The question is how long it takes, whether it's in our lifetime, whether it's now, and it's going to be different in different places, just like some places flourish and some places don't. Obviously, I have my opinions of why I'm choosing my one lifetime in this using it in this manner, pursue nuclear energy. It's because I think it's the winner long term, and I'd like to be part of that exciting adventure of making it that long term winning happen sooner. I want to see it in my prime. I want to be part of making it happen. But it, just as we were saying how long it takes to build a plant, it cannot be denied that nuclear plants are hard. They're big. They require trust. They require faith. Faith. We're a little low on faith, you know? It takes faith to pursue nuclear. There was a video going on around Twitter a few weeks ago showing Nick Clegg just savaging nuclear because it would only be available in 2021, 2022. Oh, yeah, the video was from 2014. If they just started it then, it would be here for this crisis, which, makes me think of that answer I was telling you, where there's always a horrible future crisis you can avert by building and then, unlike France, cherishing your nuclear plants. And you're never going to get away from having to provide energy. And if you build a nuclear plant, it's going to last. At this point, a new nuclear plant's going to last for about 100 years or so. We're still pushing back those limits of how long a nuclear plant can go because the parts are just either replaceable or lasting really well. And then the concrete's concrete, The Romans have concrete domes still standing from 2,000 years ago. They're not pressure tight, but that's what modern engineering is for. So any plant you build now will last. Will we get back to building them? I think I see something like the UAE, and although obviously the UAE had some special advantages in that fairly unitary government and decision making, the UAE, the Emiratis, succeeded in their nuclear because they pretty much all got behind it. I don't know whether that makes me cheered and say they still had to get behind it to be successful as a society, or if I say, ugh, how can we agree on anything ever again as big as everybody in society getting on board? How could we ever do that, Andreas? So maybe nuclear's doomed. No, I don't think so. I think that part of the pain of this energy crisis is going to get people to figure out which of their fears and which of their concerns don't matter for feeding yourself and heating your family and having warm showers and things like that, and which of your concerns are relevant. And that will be in the favor of nuclear, obviously. That's all why we're seeing the polls move in that direction, from Germany to Britain to Japan. The polls are moving in the correct direction. Then you need a program. What's a program? Well, in the UAE, again, they spent a few years getting set up to do do a good bidding process. They did a bidding process, chose a winner, and soon that winner started digging and building. The official start was about, I think, 2012. And then they had their first reactor come online, I believe it was 2019. So what is that? Oh, sorry, I guess it was 2020 for the official start. It was done before then, but they wanted to make sure it was their people in the control room, their people bearing the responsibility and the weight of operating their own energy system. Fair, right? Fair. They had foreign advisors who were experienced in nuclear plant operations, but they wanted to be the ones at the controls. So 2020, you get a unit come on. Nice. 2021, you get another. 2022, we're going to get another. 2023, we're going to get another. So was it 8 years to build? And we think of 4 reactors, was that 8 years? So what, like maybe 32 years? No, it was 8 years for 1, 9 years for 2, 10 years for 3, and 11 years for 4. And at that point, it's a quarter of their energy supply, of their electricity supply, rather. That's a program. And they got a very good price on it from the Koreans, and the Koreans are extremely motivated to land big deals to keep that up after they finish in the UAE, because they had a 5-6 year period of their own government destroying their own nuclear capabilities. Just shows you nuclear maybe is just, if people can come along and just wreck it, maybe that's not great, but the other energy sources are not doing so hot. I think that's the big thing here. In the past, when nuclear stumbled, there were interesting things to jump up and grab its spot. The dash for gas in the UK in the first great era of electricity market creation, right? Oh, it made nuclear look like a slow, dragging pile of crap, yeah? Oh, but it's not looking so good now, and the UK is deeply troubled. Like, they are going to have a horrible time of it, even compared to other European countries. I mean, helped only by slightly milder winters, I suppose. Well, I think we're going to have programs start. And if I had to look seriously at where a program is going to start, I think a program would go well in Germany, as insane as that sounds. A program, I think, would go well in the Netherlands. I think that's less insane, and they've already expressed interest. And then, of course, I'm very keenly interested to see how Poland does. I mean, I would say chopping into its coal supplies, but now it's 2022. I don't really like the feeling of saying, we'll get something to replace all that extra energy. We don't have extra energy. We need additional energy. And even just that thinking of additionality has been very hard for European leaders who came up in an environment of ease where the only thing was to turn off enough power to do your degrowth, right? Well, I'm interested in seeing what the Poles do to set up their program, and I'm actually going there for the first time in just a few weeks to give a few talks to folks in the coal mining regions about what the pace of life is with nuclear, what feeling is of developing nuclear projects, and whether that corresponds with the interests and desires of the coal mining companies and employees. I think it does. It's just, it's an argument that needs to be made.
It will be very, very interesting to watch. And Mark, you've made a very, very brilliant case and very compelling case for nuclear today at Real Vision. So Mark Nielsen, Managing Director of the Radiant Energy Group, thank you so much for joining us at Real Vision.
Thanks for the kind words, Andreas, and stay warm this winter.
I will. Thank you. What an interesting discussion with Mark Nielsen from the Radiant Energy Group. A very knowledgeable guy around a lot of issues in terms of electricity, natural gas, and obviously also the nuclear sector. So I have basically 3 takeaways from the interview. First of all, nuclear could return as a medium-term solution to the current energy crisis, but it will take likely at least 5 to 7 years before we really get nuclear back online as an alternative in Europe. But if we look for short-term conclusions, that's basically the second takeaway. We should watch the developments in Germany in relation to the decision on whether to take nuclear capacity out or not by the end of this year. There are planned shutdowns of nuclear capacity already later this year. And if we get a political decision to postpone that far into the future, then it is probably a very good signal for the European electricity market and something that could sort of reverse the current trend of higher and higher and higher electricity prices. So ultimately, my third takeaway is that it may be a viable solution for your portfolio to add an allocation towards nuclear, either via direct equity exposure towards nuclear companies or via adding a long in uranium to your portfolio as a hedge against what's going on in the current electricity market in Europe. So thanks for watching this interview.
We hope you enjoyed the video. At Real Vision, we help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy with in-depth analysis from real experts. Join the revolution at realvision.com.